Olá, meu amigo e minha amiga. Nós estamos aqui em mais um podcast da Vida Nova para trazer para você mais um lançamento da editora. O meu nome é Diego de Carlos, eu sou professor, pesquisador na área de Novo Testamento no Martin Butzer e cooperador da Vida Nova, e hoje terei o prazer de entrevistar o meu amigo querido, Dr. Peter Williams. Peter Williams é diretor-geral da Tyndale House em Cambridge. Daqui a pouco eu vou pedir para ele falar um pouquinho para nós sobre Tyndale House, o que é que eles fazem, o que é que aquele lugar, há quanto tempo aquele lugar está ali, qual a relevância também desta casa para os estudos bíblicos ao redor do mundo. O Peter já tem um livro lançado pela Edições Vida Nova, que é Podemos Confiar nos Evangelhos, um livro fantástico para você que quer um pouco mais de apologética bíblica, né, confiabilidade das escrituras voltada, esse livro em especial voltado para os evangelhos, você precisa conferir este livro, Podemos Confiar nos Evangelhos, de Peter Williams. Mas agora nós temos um segundo livro, lançamento da Edições Vida Nova, mais uma tradução fantástica, A Surpreendente Genialidade de Jesus, o que os evangelhos revelam sobre o maior de todos os mestres. Vale muito a pena ler este livro, como nós vamos conversar um pouquinho agora, e você, ao final, vai ficar ainda mais convencido de que vale a pena. Não é um livro muito grosso, você consegue ver aqui, então, bastante prático para você ler rapidinho e também presentear outros que queiram se surpreender com a genialidade do nosso Senhor Jesus Cristo. Então, sem mais delongas, vamos bater um bom papo aqui com o nosso amigo e entrevistado de hoje, Peter J. Williams. Peter, thank you so much for being with us today.
It's great to be with you.
Peter, you're the CEO of Tyndale House, Cambridge. What is Tyndale House and what does it do?
Well, starting with Cambridge, which is the city where there's one of the leading universities in the world, Cambridge University, we have a study centre and library there, which is evangelical and is like a mission centre to try and raise up Bible scholars and researchers to serve the church. So we're a hub and people come from around the world to us and they can spend lots of time or short time with us, and we're looking for them to go back out and be a blessing to their community. So we have accommodation, and so we have people living here. This week we have people from Egypt, from Finland, from Brazil, from all sorts of different places, and they are getting to know each other. And then what we do once we have this community is we also have a journal, we have a magazine, we have podcasts, we sponsor research, we do all the sorts of things that you can do when you have a mission organization based around a library. And we have the UK's best library of the Bible. It's one of the best in the world.
Who are some of the people that we might know here in Brazil, some of the scholars that we might know here that have been to Tyndale House in the past and have benefited from the library?
Well, you could think of John Piper, D.A. Carson, Wayne Grudem, Craig Blomberg, J.I. Packer, all sorts of people who've spent time in the library, many of them quite well known. And also, when you look at English Bible translations, there's been a big impact on those from people who spent time at Tyndale House. And I know other translations as well, Japanese and so on. So that's just one area of impact, but there are many more.
Praise the Lord. Okay, so let's just dive in your book now. The title of your book is A Surpreendente Genialidade de Jesus. Okay, so what do you mean by the word genius? And in what ways do the teachings of Jesus reveal that he was a genius?
Well, I think we accept very easily that Einstein or Mozart or Leonardo da Vinci are geniuses because we have things that they left, whether it's works of art or symphonies for Mozart and so on. But what I'd say is we have Jesus's teaching in the Gospels, and these things show the mind of a genius. They are works of art. And in that book, I just look at one aspect, and that is his storytelling. And the storytelling of Jesus, particularly, I focus actually on his longest story, which is about 3 minutes long, which is the story of the two sons, or the prodigal son. And just what an amazing work of art it is. There isn't a single wasted word in it. Every word is doing something, building a picture. He's able to do a lot with a small number of words. And I also show that it has complicated layers and that it's able to speak to more than one group at once. But you find the same features elsewhere in other stories of Jesus. And there's a whole area of genius I do not talk about at all in that book, which is the genius of Jesus's sayings, where he's the first person ever recorded to have said, love your enemies. That is utterly radical. So a genius is this person who's able to stand outside their culture, see things in a new way. And we find that certainly with Jesus in abundance. There are things that he says that are really life-changing. You could look at the story of the Good Samaritan that has been incredibly inspiring to many people, and many other stories. So a lot of that is just trying to look at the anatomy of the genius of Jesus's stories.
Why is Jesus's genius so surprising to us? Why do we never think of Jesus as a genius?
Well, at one level, we expect Jesus to know a lot because he is God and God knows everything. So in that sense, people are not surprised. But then that doesn't mean they've actually analyzed the teaching of Jesus. And I think the surprise is this, that it's something that you can, if you like, look at analytically and find traces of what we would recognize as brilliance in storytelling. So, for instance, the story of the two sons, or the Good Samaritan, of the prodigal son, is said in Luke's gospel, in Luke chapter 15, to be told to two contrasting groups. You've got tax collectors and sinners on the one hand, and you have scribes and Pharisees on the other hand. One group you don't expect to know the Bible, the other group you expect to know the Bible. And actually, we can demonstrate how Jesus speaks to both of these groups at the same time. Now, that's a clever thing. There's not many people are able to talk to two different groups in the same way at the same time. So speaking to a group of children and to a group of adults in such a way that you build up both, that's a skill. But to talk to two different groups of adults who have very, very different life experiences at the same time, that's rather incredible.
So your book is actually written around one parable of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
So you just said that. Could you please summarize the parable in Luke 15 to us and explain why you chose it to make your case? And by the way, what do you call it?
Yeah. So I tend to call it the story of the two sons. Now, at the beginning of Luke 15, it talks about these four sets of people in two groups. You've got the tax collectors, the sinners, the scribes, and the Pharisees. And then it says he told them this parable, and the word parable is singular. And then we have three stories. So we have the story of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and then the story of the son who goes away and then feeds the pigs, comes back, and then you hear about his older brother. And I think it's significant that it's said to be one parable, because I think that those three stories are working together to give you one set of images. So you have first, there's a story of 1 out of 100 sheep, and it goes away from home, gets lost. The shepherd goes after it, finds it, and then there is rejoicing. He calls together his friends and neighbors. And if you like, that sheep is lost away from home. Then we have the story of the coin, 1 out of 10 coins lost, and it's lost at home. The woman searches very diligently, she finds the coin, and then she invites around her female friends and neighbors to rejoice. Then we have a story of a son who goes away from home and is lost, and he returns and there's rejoicing. Then we have the story of a son who is at home, and it doesn't say he's lost, and it doesn't tell you how the story ends. So it doesn't tell you whether the older brother comes into the feast or not. And that's a very powerful thing, because you use the principles of Sudoku, where you use the numbers you have to fill in the numbers you don't have. And what we know is, if we are to fill in the ending of the story, then we can say, if that son, that older son, comes in, there will be great joy. because we have there's joy over the one who goes away from home, the sheep. There's joy over the coin at home. There's joy over the man who goes away from home, and then there would be over the one at home. And it's very powerful because we know that Jesus teaches elsewhere that a human is worth more than a sheep. And so what you see is there's this climax as we build up to the story of the two sons, and our minds are prepared for that. There are people who seem obviously to go away from God, and there are people who, in a sense, are lost at home. And it deals with both category of people. It has a brilliant balance between divine sovereignty and human responsibility. In the first two stories about the lost sheep and the lost coin, you have the searching after the coin. And then in the final one, it's about the decision of the younger son to return and what decision is the older brother going to make. Now, in this climactic final story of the two sons, that's about 3 minutes long when you read it out loud. And in that, of course, the younger son asks his father for his share of the inheritance. And then, stunningly, the father not only gives him the share of the inheritance, but it says he divided his property between them. It's plural. He gives both of the sons their property. So we know in this story that the older son has done very well. In the Old Testament, of course, an older brother would get twice the inheritance of a younger brother. So he does very well. And that means the older son owns the farm from this point onwards. And so younger son goes away, and he seems to have a wild time. It tells you very little about the wild time because Jesus is a good storyteller, and telling you about sin never makes you better off. So, and also if you tell a story about sin, you could glamorize the sin, which Jesus doesn't want to do, or you make it the story too specific. It only touches a certain sort of sin. So it's very general, very brief, but he has a wild time and he spends all his money. And then it says that there is a famine in the one particular land he happened to have gone to. And that's something people often don't see in the story. We see him as just getting into trouble because he's made bad decisions, but in fact he gets into trouble because he's made bad decisions and because he was unlucky enough to choose to go to the wrong land. So he ends up attaching himself to a citizen of the country. Now, as Jesus uses that word citizen, that rubs in the fact that the younger son doesn't belong in that country. He's a stranger, he's a foreigner. And then we find that this citizen sends him to his field to feed pigs. Now, this is a brilliant touch in the story because pigs are an unclean animal and herding animals is the lowest job anyway. So if you're a Pharisee listening to this story, you think it's going very well because this young man is getting what he deserves. And then it says he longs to be filled with the pig food or even the leftover pig food, and no one gives him anything. So he doesn't get any food. And if you don't have any food, you die, of course. And it's only when he's brought that low that he finally comes round to himself. And it gives us 2 verses where it takes us inside his mind, where he thinks about his father's hired servants and how they got more than enough food. He says, I'm going to go back to my father. And one of the things you notice with this younger son is he's always calling his father, father. All 3 times he talks to his father, twice out loud and once in his head. The first word is father. And that's a word that's missing from the older brother. When the older brother talks to his father, the first word he says is, look, all these years I've been slaving for you. So Jesus is able to do something by missing out a word in a story. And that's a very clever touch. So anyway, this younger son goes back to his father. The father sees him far off. Now that's a powerful thing because the story doesn't tell us the father was looking out for him, but that the storyteller makes us do the work to calculate that. So we realize it wasn't accident that the one person to see him return is not the older brother, it's not all the many servants, it happens to be the father. And we calculate that is by design, that is because the father was looking out all the time. But again, the storyteller doesn't waste time to do that. The storyteller wastes no words. The storyteller never tells us that that we're dealing with a farm, but he builds up a picture where you see that it really is a farm. The storyteller doesn't tell you that the older brother, that the father was always looking out, but again, he builds you that picture, so you know that. And then the father, it says, feels compassion, runs, embraces, and kisses the younger son, and that's very surprising. He should feel anger, you would think, after that younger son had wasted all that he gave him. And then he doesn't even speak to the younger son. The very first words he says are to the servants, and the storyteller hasn't wasted any time telling you how the servants ran after the father. He doesn't waste any time at all. But the first word is quick, bring the best robe. And you realize that this younger son is fully accepted back, publicly accepted back. He doesn't have to earn his way back. He's fully publicly accepted as son. He's given a ring. He's given shoes. It doesn't bother telling you he lost his shoes, but you know that he has lost his shoes because it tells you, bring shoes, put them on him. And then let's kill the fatted calf, which is going to be a lot of meat for, 400, 500 portions of meat. And let's eat and celebrate. And he says, this, my son, was dead and alive again, lost and found. That is hyperbolic, because in the story, the son wasn't literally dead, but he was, as far as the father was concerned, he was out of contact, he was dead. So the father's very emotional. Then the story switches. We're 62% of the way through, and we shift the movement from the older son, from the younger son to the older son. And it just tells you the older son was in the field. Doesn't tell you what he's doing in the field. But again, the storyteller makes you do the work. You work out he's working in the field. He's working late. When other people have stopped working and are at the party, he's working late. And it says he draws near to the house. He hears the music and dancing. Now, music and dancing can be a great celebration, or they can be the most annoying thing in the world. I mean, if you're trying to get to sleep and people have got music and dancing around you, you don't enjoy this. And so you suddenly find that there's annoyance coming out. But what he does is he asks a servant or someone nearby what's going on. That servant answers with no emotion whatsoever and says, your father has received back your brother back in good health, and that's why there's this celebration. They killed the fattened calf. And you go from that non-emotional answer immediately to the older brother's anger. The father goes out to him, and then he bursts out. And it never tells you this is the first time he's burst out in anger, but you absolutely know he's been holding back the anger, and then it all comes out. And so it's a lot of emotional intelligence in this story. Emotions switched on and off, emotions implied, all this sort of stuff going on. And he says, all these years, I have been slaving for you. Well, that's interesting, because he's actually his son, not his slave. And he hasn't been working for his dad. He's been working on his own farm that his dad gave him many years ago. So he's a son who thinks of himself as a slave. He says, you never gave me a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But actually, the dad gave him every goat on the farm and has not banned friends from coming round. And he said, but when this son of yours came, so he denies that his brother is his brother. He said, you killed the fatted calf for him. Although, of course, lots of other people are going to enjoy the fatted calf. And he says, this son of yours who devoured your livelihood with prostitutes. How does the older brother know? He cannot possibly know that, because he has just come in from the field and his younger brother has been dead. He's been nowhere in contact. So the only source of information he has about his younger brother's expenses is his imagination. So he imagines that his brother has been spending his money with prostitutes, but Jesus never told us that in the story. And he says, you killed the fattened calf for him. And then the father answers so graciously that everything I have is yours. And that is literally true. But we had to celebrate because this, your brother. So he turns, the older brother said, this son of yours. Father turns it around and says, this, your brother was dead and alive again. He's lost and is found. So you have the dead and alive again, lost and found, like a chorus at these two different points in the story. And every single word is doing something. And I've missed out so much in the story, but that gives you the rough idea of what happens in the story.
Ah, fantastic. You've said something about it already, but what else can you tell us about the audience? And how do you see Jesus engaging with it?
Yeah. So I think tax collectors could well be Jews, but they're Jews who have sold their soul, if you like, to the Roman Empire. They are working, collecting money on behalf of the Romans. Sinners are people who are, obviously everyone is a sinner, but these are people who are in flagrant breach of the laws of the Old Testament or the laws of the Jews. And so they don't seem to care much about the Bible. Pharisees care a lot about the Bible, and they spend their time studying the Bible to see how they can separate from sin. That Pharisee means separator, and scribes spend their time copying the Bible out by hand. So scribes know the Bible super well, and sinners probably don't. And Jesus is able to speak in a way where this story works if you don't know the Bible at all, and it works at a deeper level if you do know the Bible. So, for instance, Jesus is talking to scribes, and he says that the father runs, embraces, and kisses the younger son. Now, there's only one time in the entire Bible that collection of things, run, embrace, kiss, comes together. And that is when Esau, the older brother, connected with the field, who had been cheated out of his entire inheritance, welcomes back his younger brother Jacob from a far country. Genesis chapter 33, verse 4. And so it is so striking that his brother Jacob is coming back from a far country, and bad Esau runs, embraces, and kisses him. And Esau, who had been cheated out of a lot of money, a lot of wealth, forgives him. And that's really stunning. And we can also show that verse was very well known to scribes. Scribes have to count similar phrases to make sure they don't mistake one for another. They memorize a lot of the Bible. It's in the book of Genesis, which is one of the best known books in the Bible for a scribe. But also we can show that verse has a special place in the scribe's curriculum at the time of Jesus. And this is a very interesting thing. The evidence is in the book. And so basically the dramatic high point of the story, I don't know if you've ever seen the film The Truman Show. There's a point where Truman meets his maker, and it's very important for the music to get really dramatic at this point. This moment, you picture it. Rembrandt draws it when the younger son comes together with the father. It is the biggest picture in the entire story. And Jesus has that high point of the story coincide with something that comes from the scribe's own curriculum. And this is an amazing thing to be able to do. So that's just one example of the measurable genius of this story that people often do not know about.
Fantastic. Picking up on those connections, what do you see as the role of the Old Testament in the story of the two sons?
It's got a very deep role. I mean, just about everything in the story is based off the Old Testament, particularly the book of Genesis. So when the story begins, a man had two sons. That can trigger all sorts of things if you know the Bible well. So the most famous person to have two and only two sons is Isaac, the father of Esau and Jacob. We've already heard how the story connects with them. And the brother complains, "You never gave me a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends." There's only one meal of young goat in the entire Bible, and that is when Jacob tricks his father, Isaac, who is blind and cannot see afar off, pretending that he is his older brother. And at the time, he is wearing the robe of Esau. Now, remember, in Jesus' story, it goes, "Bring out the best robe." Not the best clothes, the best robe. Well, who does that belong to? It's either the father or the older brother. So there's all sorts of connection with the story of Isaac. But of course, it also connects with the story of Abraham, because Abraham famously had two sons. He had some more later, but he had Ishmael and Isaac. And Abraham is the first man in the Bible to run. He is the archetypal father who runs. In Genesis 18, he runs, and the first word from his mouth is the word quick, the same as the father's first words in this story. So the first time, if you're a scribe, you copy the word quick in the entire Bible, is Abraham running when he is an old man. He's 99, and he's running to meet these guests. And it's also the first time you have a calf in the Bible, because Abraham gets a calf ready to have a feast for God and the two angels who are visiting him. And so this is an amazing, well-known passage. It's very well known in Jews at the time. And so Jesus is basing things off that. And of course, Abraham is the only father in the entire Bible who gives away his inheritance while he is still alive. He does not give it all to both sons. He actually gives it just to the younger son. Ishmael loses the inheritance because in Genesis 21, it says, when Abraham made a feast for his younger son, Isaac, when he is weaned, taken off milk and onto solids, that Ishmael laughs at the feast for Isaac. And that is when Sarah says he must lose his inheritance. So all of this is going on. And so in a sense, it's implying if you despise the feast for the younger son, you will lose your inheritance. And it's saying to scribes and Pharisees, if you despise the tax collectors and sinners eating with Jesus, which is the context of this story, you can lose your spiritual inheritance. But then a man had two sons can also remind you of Adam. He had two sons. He had some more later. And the first conflict in the Bible is the story of an older son, Cain, being envious at the acceptance of the younger son, Abel. The older son is connected with the field, the younger son with herding animals. And you have this conversation between God and Cain about Cain's anger, which is rather like the conversation between the father in Jesus' story and the older brother. So all of these things are going on. And then there's more, because the story, has a great famine in it, not just any old famine, a great famine. And what the father says is, quickly bring out a ring and a robe. Well, there's only one time that someone gets a ring and a robe in the Bible. That's Joseph suddenly coming out of prison before Pharaoh, Genesis 41, verse 42, at a time of great famine. And of course, he is the only other son that had gone to a far country, and therefore his father thought was dead and then was alive again. So all of these details across Genesis come up in this story, and it's rather remarkable. There's so much more. Again, read the book.
Fantastic. Thank you for not spoiling it for us. I have a twofold question now based on what you just said. And I think that the first part of it you've answered somehow. I'm going to ask it anyway. Do you think that Jesus's audience would have understood all these allusions to the Old Testament? And the second question related to that is, what's the importance of the Old Testament for our understanding of the New Testament in general and of Jesus in particular?
Yeah, thank you. Well, with the question whether they would understand, I don't know. The last verse in the preceding chapter, so Luke chapter 14, is Jesus saying, let the one who has ears to hear, hear. And I think that scripture is done in such a way that you cannot hear it, you don't pay attention, or you can pay attention and you do hear what God is saying. So I think for a scribe and a Pharisee, it's less a question of what is their intellect than are they listening? Are they listening? Because if they're not paying attention, they could miss out on seeing that they have genius in front of them. They have God's Son in front of them. They have the one who knows the Old Testament better than any of them. They could miss that. And in terms of its significance today, let's remember that Christ quotes the Old Testament a lot. He validates the Old Testament. He tells us that it's very important. It's the word of God that cannot be broken. And he weaves the Old Testament into his stories. Well, do you care about Jesus's stories? If you do, you need to read the Old Testament. Do you care about the life of Jesus? If you do, you need to read the Old Testament. You look at, say, the opening chapters of Matthew's Gospel. Matthew chapter 1 is a genealogy of Jesus rather like the genealogy in Genesis chapter 5. Matthew chapter 2 is Jesus going down to Egypt and coming out of Egypt, rather like Israel does at the Exodus. Matthew chapter 3 is Jesus being baptized in the River Jordan, and it says to fulfill all righteousness. And this is rather like Israel going through the water. And then Matthew chapter 4 is Jesus being tested for 40 days out in the desert, rather like Israel being tested for 40 years out in the desert. Matthew chapter 5 is Jesus giving the law from the mountain, rather like God gave the law to Moses from the mountain. And like, if you don't know the Old Testament, how can you read the life of Jesus? It just makes so much more sense when you read the Old Testament. So I'd say that the Old Testament's really important, and you cannot say, oh, I like Jesus, I like his stories, but I'm not going to take any notice of the Old Testament. If you love Jesus, you will love the Old Testament.
Shifting gears a bit, do you believe that there is a significant difference between the actual words of Jesus and what is recorded in the Gospels? Couldn't Luke have made up this story, for example?
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's a great question. And the answer is, I think basically no, that that what we're getting in the Gospels is the stories as Jesus told them. Now, already we know that over in Matthew chapter 18, there is a story of a lost sheep. So you can't say Luke made that story up unless you say Luke came first and Matthew copied him, which is, it becomes a complicated thing. Then you know that over in Matthew chapter 21, you have a story that begins, a man had two sons, and it's a different story. It's a story about, he tells one to go out in the vineyard and he says no, but then goes. Another, he says go and he says yes, and then doesn't go. So it's a different story with the same sort of reversal idea in it. It makes the most sense to say that Jesus came up with both stories, because I won't explain how Matthew's gospel arises if I say Luke makes up the opening, a man had two sons. Then I find that Jesus is using the same bits of the Old Testament as we find elsewhere. So for instance, in Genesis chapter 18, verse 6, along runs Abraham and he says to Sarah, quick, then 3 measures, or literally seahs, it's a particular sort of measure of flour. Then he goes and gets the fatted calf. Now, what's interesting is in Matthew and Luke, Jesus has this story about a woman like Sarah putting yeast into 3 seahs of flour and it all growing. And he says that's what the kingdom of heaven's like. So it seems that Jesus has taken that verse and put bits of it into his longest story and bits of it into his shortest story. And that makes most sense if it comes from the mind of God, or mind of Jesus. And then you look at the way the story ends, and it ends by saying it was necessary. The father says it was necessary to celebrate. Well, hang on. This is the way that Jesus ends a story over in Matthew's gospel, because you get that in Matthew chapter 18, where the master of the unforgiving servant said, wasn't it necessary for you to forgive? So in other words, the same patterns of speech that we're seeing in Matthew are turning up in Luke. So it makes no sense to say that Luke invents these. And in the book, I actually draw up a profile of who has to be the one who comes up with this story. It has to be someone who knows the Old Testament, knows Jewish traditions, knows rabbinic traditions and parables, knows the land of Jesus, and also has the patterns of speech that show up elsewhere on what Jesus says elsewhere in the Gospels. And it doesn't make a lot of sense to say that's Luke. Now, remember that all 4 Gospels show us Jesus's genius. In John's Gospel, for instance, you have the saying, the truth will set you free. That is an amazing statement, which you can experience in your life. Often people are held back and almost feel like they're bound by lies. And here we have Jesus saying something genius over in John's Gospel. And each of the different Gospels has really clever sayings of Jesus. the poor you will always have with you. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword. A kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. All these sorts of things which make sense. And love your neighbors, but also love your enemies. I mean, this is an amazing thing. Love your neighbor as yourself. It's turn the other cheek. Wow, that's an amazing idea. And so what I'd say is the easiest explanation is that the genius all comes from Jesus. And then any other explanation is going to be more complicated. So you actually have to invent several different geniuses. One genius to get the material for Luke, one genius to get material for John and Matthew, and it becomes much more complicated. So at the end of the day, it's not a question of proof, it's a question of simplicity. The Christian view that Jesus generated all of these sayings and stories is the simplest explanation. That's it. It's the simplest, and all other things being equal, it's therefore the best.
Amen. You make a very compelling argument for the genius of Jesus. The question is, where did Jesus receive all this training? And did he receive it as a divine being, as a human, both ends?
So it's interesting that Luke twice early on in Luke chapter 2 tells us that Jesus grew in wisdom. And so that's a very, very interesting thing for me, because what I think it means is that in the incarnation, things were not made easier for Christ. So he becomes fully human and he has to learn like we learn. I therefore believe that although he has access to God's knowledge, he is God, that he doesn't use that access. He studies the scriptures. It says he went to the temple as a 12-year-old and he asked the experts. He asked the priests. That's an interesting thing. He is seeking to understand. And of course, he understands perfectly, better than anyone. But it's not that we need to memorize the scriptures and Jesus didn't have to bother. No, Jesus, I believe, had to work. Now, I would say that that's just my opinion. But the orthodoxy has a very broad range of possibilities. So obviously, as the divine son, as the Son of God, Jesus knows everything. But in his time on earth, he doesn't access all of that knowledge. And so it says that he does not know, the Son does not know the hour of his return, although the Father does. And that's a striking thing. But what I take that to mean is that he is not accessing that knowledge. He could, but it's like we might have a system whereby we anonymize something to ourselves, even though we know we could access that.
What implications for Christian life can we draw from the story of the two sons?
Well, I think it's a big lesson in forgiveness and acceptance. The father forgives, and the father does what the older son should have done. It should have been the older son running and embracing and kissing his brother, because he won the jackpot, the lottery, through his younger brother asks dad for the inheritance, and he gets his inheritance early. This is amazing. He should be so sad when his little brother leaves. He should be so glad when he comes back, but he's not like that. So I think there is a lot of lesson for us who might be like a big brother, resentful at the acceptance of the younger son, even resenting the thought that he might live off some of what you have. And so I think it's a big lesson in accepting people, and in the church, that we don't wait for people to stand outside and gradually earn their way back in. The Father is excessively generous, and I think that's the way we're encouraged to be. But also, there's a wonderful lesson if you're like the younger son and you've gone away from God, that he's always there, ready to accept you back.
I find it very interesting that we very quickly resonate with the younger brother. Mm-hmm. But we very rarely would think of ourselves as behaving like the older brother.
Yeah. But I think in churches, often that's what we can be like. I mean, you think about it. If you're a scribe and a Pharisee, you've been keeping all the rules, and there are those sinners over there who've been breaking them, maybe sexually, maybe other things. They're getting together with the Romans. The tax collectors are giving money to your oppressors. And then how can they turn around and then get access to God? You've been working on your access to God for decades. And can they just, walk right in? And so that message about the access to God being so quick and so instant through Christ, I think is really important. All our decades of going to church and working hard don't put us in better standing with God.
Can we also draw some implications from Jesus's teachings for the practices of evangelical scholars? And how about for preachers?
For preachers, right. So what I'd say is certainly it shows the value of studying the scriptures deeply. There are treasures in them, and Christ has those treasures. Sometimes they're hidden, they've got to be dug for. And even a familiar story like this story is worth digging in. So I think the problem with this story, it can be a bit like the story of the Titanic, and we know what happened to the Titanic. It sank, and so there's no suspense there. And we know, once we've heard this story once, that the father runs and embraces the younger son, and so we think, well, that's it, I know the story. And so what happens is someone reads that out loud in church, and you sort of switch off. Oh, I know this bit. Yeah. And that's where we really need to pay attention and say, let me try and learn from this thing that Jesus is saying. So I think expect amazing things from Christ's words, and you will find them.
In your opinion, has anyone's teaching in history had as strong an impact on the world as Jesus's? Can you elaborate on that?
I don't think so. I mean, look, there are 2 billion people who claim to follow Jesus' teaching. Now, of course, there are massive numbers of Muslims, and it's not as many as would say they're following Christ. But of course, even I think with the teachings of Islam, there's an element of dependence on the teachings of Christianity. So that is, Christianity came first. Jesus is mentioned in the Quran, and so on. So although I don't think it gives a proper representation of what Jesus said, I think you can argue, look, he is by far the most influential teacher that there is. And so if you were to put together the Christians and the Muslims, and I'm not saying we want to do that in a simplistic way, as well as all of the non-Christians who've been influenced by Christian teaching. So there's a lot of argument from people like Tom Holland that secular West is very dependent on Christian teaching. A lot of the human rights movement depends on Christian teaching. The idea that we have in modern disabilities concerns that we should care for the weak, again, that comes from Jesus. So I'd want to say that surely we can show that although we want the message of Jesus to be better known across the globe, there has been influence on the majority of living people today on the planet from Jesus's teaching. And I don't think there's anyone else that you get close to with that. I mean, like, obviously Aristotle has had some effect, particularly in the West, and there may be other ways. Plato, likewise. These are very influential, but I don't think anyone has the influence that Christ has, and certainly not. I mean, there aren't modern day Aristotelians who say, I basically can live my life by the teachings of Aristotle, and not even a modern day Platonist, and there are modern day Platonists, would say, I live my life by the teachings of Plato, because that would be crazy, because you take children away from their parents, according to Plato's Republic, and have them, educated so that the parents don't even know who their children are, and the children don't know who their parents are. I mean, the whole thing's crazy. No, so I'd want to say, yes, Jesus is obviously the top teacher ever.
Lovely. Coming to an end. All right, let's do our final questions. if it's possible to answer that question. What is the single best explanation for Jesus's genius?
Well, that he is the Son of God, he is God, that he is filled with the Holy Spirit, and that's where it comes. Now, of course, much of the incarnation is a mystery. There are things we don't understand about that, but I would say the opening of John's Gospel gives us a lot. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then, of course, the Word became flesh. So in a sense, the eternal Word, the Son, communicates to us who God is. So he came into the world to show us who God is, and including on the cross, where he shows us his love and pays the price for our sins. And so I think that this is all bound up with Christ is the one sent into the world. He is the one specially anointed, that's what Christ means, by God, and designated to say, he is my ruler in the world. He is the one who tells you who I am. All of that is what Christ does.
Thank you. Now, closing our interview, our last question is, how does Jesus's genius challenge us?
Well, I think it challenges us to look more deeply into his teachings, and also to realize there is no better teacher. So if you want to ask the question, how should I live my life? Well, the teaching of Jesus, and of course, his apostles. So remember, apostle means a sent one. The apostles are those he sent. So you don't just say Jesus is teaching, but his apostles, those he sends. That's what we should be basing our lives on.
Peter, thank you so much for being with us today. It was a pleasure to hear you. And this was our interview of this issue of our podcast for Vida Nova. Thank you, Peter. God bless.
God bless.
Olha, se você ainda não adquiriu o seu livro, você precisa entrar no site da Vida Nova agora mesmo e comprar, fazer o pedido deste livro e devorá-lo. Esse livro é fantástico. O Peter apenas nos deu uma pequena amostra, né, só para dar um gostinho do seu argumento e da riqueza que nós encontramos na história dos dois irmãos, que o Peter detalha para a gente, trazendo algumas lições fantásticas nesse livro, A Surpreendente Genialidade de Jesus. Muito obrigado por ficar conosco ao longo dessa entrevista. Que Deus te abençoe e até a próxima.